December 23rd, 1896. Killarney Estate, County Kerry, Ireland. The gamekeeper's hands trembled as he lifted his lantern higher. In the frozen pre-dawn darkness of the deer park, something gleamed against the frost-covered ground. As he approached, the scene before him defied all natural explanation. Thomas Brennan, notorious poacher and local vagrant, hung suspended 3 feet above the earth. A massive red deer stag lay dead beneath him, its antlers driven completely through Brennan's torso with such force that the tines protruded from his back. The poacher's loaded rifle lay in the grass 10 feet away, unfired. No footprints disturbed the frost around the scene except those of the deer itself. The estate's owner, Lord Edward Ashworth, stood at his manor window, watching the discovery unfold with peculiar calm. His alibi was unshakable. He had been hosting a dinner party for 12 prominent guests the entire evening. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Killarney Estate Deer Park and the impossible death that shocked Victorian Ireland, make sure to subscribe to The Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We bring you the darkest forgotten chapters of history that textbooks dare not mention. In the comments below, tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's descend into the shadows of 1896. The winter of 1896 found Ireland trapped between two worlds. The Great Famine's scars still marked the landscape 50 years later, while the Anglo-Irish aristocracy clung desperately to their estates as Land League agitation threatened their ancient privileges. County Kerry, with its wild mountains and isolated valleys, remained a stronghold of the old order, a place where Norman lords still ruled over tenant farmers whose families had worked the same soil for generations. Killarney Estate encompassed 7,000 acres of the most pristine wilderness in Ireland. Lord Edward Ashworth, the 5th Baron of Killarney, had inherited the property in 1889 at the age of 32. Unlike his predecessors, Edward showed little interest in the social obligations of his class. He rarely traveled to Dublin or London, preferring the isolation of his ancestral home. The local gentry whispered about his peculiar habits, the way he walked the deer park alone at night, the exotic books imported from the continent, the month-long disappearances with no explanation. The estate's deer park represented the crown jewel of Ashworth's holdings. Over 200 red deer roamed the ancient oak forest, descendants of herds that had grazed there since before the Norman invasion. Ashworth maintained the park with obsessive care, personally overseeing every aspect of its management. He employed 6 gamekeepers, an unusually high number, and had petitioned the courts for the harshest penalties against poachers. Thomas Brennan embodied everything Lord Ashworth despised. Born in 1851 to a family evicted during the famine, Brennan had grown up in the hedge schools and workhouses that serviced Ireland's dispossessed. By 1896, he had accumulated 17 convictions for poaching across 3 counties. Local magistrates knew him well, a clever, bitter man who saw the deer park's abundance as a personal insult while tenant families survived on potatoes and cabbage. But Brennan possessed an uncanny skill that had kept him out of prison. He knew the rhythms of the wilderness better than any gamekeeper. He could move through the forest without sound, read the weather in the taste of the wind, and vanish into the landscape like smoke. The authorities suspected him of dozens of deer kills, but they had never caught him in the act. The 2 men had crossed paths before. In September 1895, Ashworth's gamekeepers had discovered Brennan on estate grounds. The poacher had no weapon, no evidence of illegal activity. He claimed to be Gath, erring mushrooms. Ashworth himself had ridden out to confront him. Witnesses reported a heated exchange, but the specific words were never recorded. Brennan left without arrest, but something in his eyes made the gamekeepers nervous. In the weeks that followed, estate workers reported strange occurrences. Deer were found dead without apparent cause, their bodies unmarked but still warm. Fences showed signs of tampering. Most disturbing, several servants reported seeing lights moving through the deer park at impossible hours, too deliberate to be will-o-wisps, too erratic to be lanterns. Lord Ashworth's behavior grew stranger. He spent entire nights in his library, refusing entry even to his most trusted servants. The cook later testified that she would hear him speaking in the small hours, though no other voice ever answered. He commissioned a local blacksmith to forge a series of elaborate iron stakes, then dismissed the man before explaining their purpose. Something was building in the darkness of Killarney Estate. The deer grew nervous, stampeding at shadows. The gamekeepers began working in pairs, refusing to patrol alone. And Thomas Brennan, who had evaded capture for decades, made a fatal mistake. November 12, 1896. The first incident that should have served as a warning occurred on a moonless Tuesday night. Patrick O'Sullivan, the head gamekeeper, was completing his evening rounds when he heard something that stopped him cold, a sound unlike anything in his 30 years of forestry work. He described it later as a screaming that weren't human nor animal, but something caught between the two. The sound came from the heart of the deer park, where the oldest oaks formed a natural cathedral of twisted branches. O'Sullivan found 13 deer dead in a perfect circle, each animal lying with its head pointed toward the center. Their eyes were open, but showed no sign of fear or struggle. The veterinary surgeon who examined the carcasses could find no cause of death, no poison, no trauma, no disease. Their hearts had simply stopped, simultaneously, as if at a command. Lord Ashworth arrived at the scene within minutes, despite the fact that the incident occurred nearly a mile from the manor house. How he knew to come, he never explained. He ordered the carcasses burned immediately, over O'Sullivan's protests that the authorities should be notified. When the gamekeeper insisted, Ashworth's response chilled him to his core. "There are authorities beyond those in Dublin, O'Sullivan, and they have already been consulted." The estate workers began to talk. Ashworth paid them well enough to ensure their silence to outsiders, but among themselves they shared their observations. The scullery maid had seen strange diagrams chalked onto the floor of Ashworth's library, geometric patterns that hurt her eyes to look upon. The stablemaster reported that horses refused to approach the deer park gates after sunset, no matter how harshly they were spurred. And the groundskeeper's daughter, who cleaned the manor's guest rooms, found a journal written in languages she didn't recognize, filled with sketches of deer in positions of apparent agony. December 3rd, 1896. The second incident involved Thomas Brennan directly. Brennan walked into the Rose and Crown pub in Killarney town at 9:30, his hands shaking badly enough that he could barely hold his whiskey. The publican, James Foley, knew Brennan as a man of iron nerves who had once set a broken leg himself with a tree branch and rope. To see him trembling drew immediate attention. "I've seen something in them woods," Brennan announced to the room. "Something that don't belong in God's creation." The assembled drinkers pressed him for details. Brennan described tracking a large stag through the deer park 3 nights prior, following it deep into the oldest section of the forest. He had the animal in his sights when the stag suddenly stopped and turned to look directly at him. Not with the glassy panic of prey, but with an intelligence that froze the poacher's finger on the trigger. "It spoke," Brennan insisted, his voice rising. "Not with words, but I heard it in my head all the same. It knew my name, it knew what I'd done and what I planned to do. And it told me that the lord of the estate had made arrangements for men like me." The pub erupted in laughter and mockery. Brennan was known to drink heavily, and his story sounded like delirium tremens. But Foley noticed something the others missed. When Brennan rolled up his sleeve to make a point, his forearm bore a pattern of small circular burns, too precise to be accidental, arranged in a spiral that seemed to rotate when you looked at it directly. Brennan left the pub an hour later, still muttering about the deer and Lord Ashworth. It was the last time anyone saw him alive, until December 23rd. December 15th, 1896. The third incident forced the local constabulary to take notice. Father Michael Brennan, no relation to Thomas's, served as the parish priest for Killarney. A pragmatic man who had little patience for superstition, he nonetheless felt obligated to investigate when 3 separate parishioners reported the same disturbing dream. In these visions, they saw the deer of Ashworth's park gathering in the ancient oak grove, standing in concentric circles around a central figure they couldn't quite see. The deer's eyes glowed like coals, and from somewhere came a voice speaking words that sounded like Latin but predated Latin, words that felt dangerous to remember. Father Brennan decided to visit Lord Ashworth directly. The priest arrived at the estate on a gray afternoon, the winter sun already setting at 4:30. Ashworth received him in the library, a room that Father Brennan later described as unwholesome, filled with books that seemed to breathe malice. The conversation began cordially enough, but when Father Brennan mentioned the dreams, Ashworth's demeanor changed entirely. His face went blank, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, flatter, older, as if something else was using his mouth to form words. "The church abandoned Ireland during the famine, Father. Perhaps it's time to remember there were powers in this land before Christianity arrived. Powers that never truly left, only waited for someone to invoke them properly." Father Brennan fled. He reported the encounter to the bishop in Dublin, who dismissed it as aristocratic eccentricity. But the priest began conducting protective blessings around the parish, and he kept a jar of holy water beside his bed. December 20th, 1896. The final incident before Thomas Brennan's death. Every gamekeeper on the estate quit on the same day. They arrived at the manor house as a group, refusing to explain their decision beyond vague references to unnatural occurrences and responsibilities to their families. Lord Ashworth didn't argue or attempt to persuade them. He simply paid their wages in full and watched them leave. Patrick O'Sullivan, speaking years later, revealed what had driven them to that decision. 3 nights earlier, all 6 gamekeepers had been conducting a night patrol together. Safety in numbers. When they encountered something in the deer park that shattered their understanding of the natural world. The entire herd, over 200 deer, stood motionless in the central clearing. They weren't grazing or resting. They simply stood, facing the same direction, toward a point where Lord Ashworth stood alone in the moonlight. He was speaking. The gamekeepers could hear his voice, but couldn't understand the language. And as they watched, one of the deer walked forward of its own accord, approached Ashworth and lowered its head. What happened next O'Sullivan would only describe as a transaction. The deer collapsed, dead. Ashworth bent down and seemed to draw something from the animal's body. Not blood, not visible at all, but the gamekeepers saw the air shimmer and watched Ashworth inhale deeply, as if breathing in smoke they couldn't see. When Ashworth turned and saw the gamekeepers watching, he smiled. It wasn't a threatening expression or an angry one. It was the smile of someone who no longer cared about maintaining pretenses. The gamekeepers ran. They didn't stop until they reached town, and they didn't return to the estate even to collect their belongings. Lord Edward Ashworth now maintained his 7,000 acres entirely alone, and somewhere in the winter darkness, Thomas Brennan was making his fatal decision to poach one last deer. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. The investigation that follows reveals evidence that authorities tried to suppress for decades. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries, because what happens next challenges everything we think we know about Victorian Ireland. Let's discover the truth that the Ashworth family spent a fortune trying to bury. December 23, 1896, 5:47 a.m. Michael Donovan had worked as a groundskeeper at Killarney estate for 3 months, hired after the mass resignation of the gamekeepers. He knew nothing of the previous incidents. He was a simple man from Tralee who needed employment and asked few questions. This ignorance saved his sanity, though it couldn't save him from what he was about to witness. His morning rounds took him through the deer park at first light, checking the fences for damage from the storms that had battered County Kerry for the previous week. The sun hadn't fully risen, and frost covered everything in a delicate crystalline coating that crunched beneath his boots. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air. He noticed the blood first. Not much, just a few drops darkening the frost, leading deeper into the oak grove. Donovan followed, assuming a deer had injured itself on the fence. The trail led to the central clearing, and there he stopped, his lantern falling from nerveless fingers. The scene before him violated the natural order so completely that his mind initially refused to process it. Thomas Brennan hung suspended in the air, 3 feet above the ground. A massive red deer stag, one of the largest Donovan had ever seen, lay dead directly beneath the poacher. But the deer wasn't simply dead. It had been positioned with impossible precision, lying on its side with its antlers pointed straight up like spears. And those antlers had been driven completely through Brennan's body. The physics made no sense. Brennan weighed perhaps 12 stone. The stag's antlers, while formidable, couldn't support that weight without breaking or being driven into the ground. Yet there Brennan hung, impaled through the abdomen, with 6 tines of antler protruding from his back. No blood pooled on the ground beneath him. It had all been absorbed by his clothing, frozen in the December cold. Brennan's face was locked in an expression that Donovan would see in nightmares for the rest of his life. Not pain or fear, but recognition. His eyes, still open, seemed to be looking at something beyond the physical world, something he finally understood. 10 feet away lay Brennan's rifle, a weapon Donovan later learned the poacher had carried for 15 years. It was loaded, the safety off, a round chambered. But it had not been fired. Whatever had happened to Thomas Brennan had occurred before he could even attempt to defend himself. Donovan ran for the manor house, his boots slipping on the frost. He pounded on the door until a servant answered, then gasped out his discovery. Within minutes, Lord Ashworth appeared, fully dressed despite the early hour, as if he had been awake and waiting. Ashworth's reaction was the detail that Donovan never forgot. The Lord showed no surprise, no horror, no shock. He simply nodded once and said, "I see. I'll contact the constabulary. Don't speak of this to anyone." But Donovan had already seen too much to remain silent. The Killarney constabulary arrived at 9 o'clock, led by Sergeant William McCarthy, a 15-year veteran who had investigated everything from cattle theft to domestic murders. Nothing in his experience prepared him for the scene in the deer park. McCarthy's official report, preserved in the Kerry County Archives, struggles to maintain professional detachment. The deceased was found in a position inconsistent with known causes of death by animal attack. The stag in question, a red deer of approximately 20 stone, was positioned beneath the body with mathematical precision. The antlers penetrated the deceased's abdomen at the solar plexus, exiting through the lumbar vertebrae. The angle of penetration suggests a force from above rather than below, which contradicts the physical arrangement of the scene. No evidence of struggle was present. The ground frost remained undisturbed in a radius of 15 feet around the bodies, save for the tracks of the deer itself, which appeared to have approached from the east and collapsed in its current position. The deceased's weapon was found unfired, eliminating the possibility of a hunting accident. Most puzzling is the complete absence of the deer's blood. The animal showed no external wounds, yet appears to have died simultaneously with or moments before the deceased. How the antlers penetrated human tissue with sufficient force to suspend the body remains unexplained. McCarthy called for a surgeon from Dublin, Dr. Robert Fitzgerald, who arrived the following day. Fitzgerald's autopsy revealed details that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Brennan had died from the antler wounds, certainly, but the pattern of internal damage made no sense. The antlers had penetrated his body with such force that they had shattered his spine and punctured both kidneys. Yet the surrounding tissue showed minimal trauma, as if the antlers had passed through him like hot knives through butter. No human or animal force could achieve such penetration without causing massive collateral damage. More disturbing were Fitzgerald's other findings. Brennan's pupils were massively dilated, suggesting extreme fear or the presence of belladonna. His fingernails contained traces of oak bark, indicating he had clawed desperately at something wooden in his final moments. And his brain tissue showed small hemorrhages consistent with severe psychological shock, the kind of trauma caused by witnessing something the mind cannot accept. The surgeon found one final detail that he hesitated to include in his official report. Brennan's body temperature, measured 6 hours after death in freezing conditions, was 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Human bodies cool after death, they don't heat up. Fitzgerald submitted his findings with a note that Kerry authorities chose not to make public. In 30 years of medical practice, I have never encountered a death that so thoroughly defies natural explanation. If I believed in supernatural causes, I would say this man died of fright while something impossible killed him. Since I cannot believe such things, I can only certify that Thomas Brennan died on December 23, 1896, by means unknown. The deer park held one more secret. When investigators finally examined the ground more carefully in daylight, they found marks in the frost that the initial response had missed. Surrounding the death scene in a perfect circle were small depressions in the earth, hundreds of them, each exactly the size and shape of a deer's hoofprint. The deer had been there, watching, standing in formation, and at the center of that circle, where Brennan had died, someone had carved symbols into the frozen earth, symbols that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to writhe when observed from the corner of the eye. Father Brennan was called to examine them. He refused to speak their meaning aloud, but he consecrated the ground and strongly advised that the earth be dug up and buried in unconsecrated ground. The authorities ignored his recommendation. Hay would come to regret that decision. The investigation into Thomas Brennan's death should have been straightforward. A poacher had died under mysterious circumstances on private property. The landowner had an unshakable alibi. The case should have been ruled an accident, closed and forgotten. Instead, it became one of the most contentious legal proceedings in Victorian Ireland's history. The problem began with Lord Ashworth's alibi. On the evening of December 22nd, he had hosted a dinner party at the Manor House. 12 guests, all members of the Anglo-Irish gentry, all willing to swear under oath that Ashworth had been present from 7 in the evening until 3 in the morning. The dinner had been elaborate, with 7 courses and entertainment provided by musicians brought from Dublin. Sergeant McCarthy interviewed each guest separately. Their stories aligned perfectly, too perfectly. Each person recalled the same menu, the same conversations, even the same jokes in the same sequence. It was as if they were reading from a script. One guest broke under sustained questioning. Lady Margaret Thornton, a widow of 63 with a reputation for unshakable honesty, finally admitted, "I don't remember the dinner, Sergeant. I remember arriving, and I remember leaving, but the hours between are simply absent. I have the feeling it happened, but I cannot recall a single genuine detail. It's as if someone told me what occurred and I accepted it as memory." McCarthy brought in a specialist from Dublin, a psychologist named Dr. Edmund Sharp, who had studied memory and suggestion. Sharp interviewed all 12 guests and reached a disturbing conclusion. They had been subjected to artificial memory implantation, a phenomenon he had only read about in continental psychology journals. Someone had convinced them, through means Sharp couldn't identify, that an entire evening had occurred when it had not. Lord Ashworth could not be placed at the scene of Brennan's death. but his alibi had dissolved into impossibility. The prosecution, led by Crown Solicitor James Healy, built their case on circumstantial evidence. They established motive. Brennan had poached Ashworth's deer for years. They demonstrated opportunity. Ashworth had been alone on the estate with no gamekeepers to witness his movements. They presented character evidence, Ashworth's strange behavior, his obsession with the deer park, his collection of occult literature. But they couldn't answer the central question: how had Brennan died? The defense, led by one of Dublin's most expensive barristers, Arthur Penrose, hammered this point relentlessly. The prosecution asks you to believe that my client somehow forced a living deer to impale a man through its antlers, then arranged the scene to appear supernatural. This is madness. The medical evidence shows clearly that no human agency could have created these wounds. Mr. Brennan died by misadventure, a tragic accident of nature that my client had no part in. The trial became a media sensation. Newspapers across Ireland and England covered it daily, each adding their own sensational details. The Cork Examiner ran a series of articles on the supernatural poacher case. The Times of London sent their best investigative reporter, who interviewed everyone from Ashworth's childhood nanny to Dublin occultists who claimed to recognize the symbols found at the death scene. It was this reporter, Harrison Webb, who uncovered the most damning evidence. Webb discovered that Lord Ashworth had been corresponding with a Johann Krieger, a German scholar of pre-Christian European religions who had been dismissed from 3 universities for dangerous research. The letters, which Webb obtained through a bribed servant, discussed the ancient compact between the land and its rulers and blood ceremonies that bind the wild to human will. In one particularly revealing letter dated August 1896, Ashworth wrote, "I have succeeded where my ancestors failed. The deer no longer merely inhabit my land, they have become extensions of my will. The old ways work, Krieger. The sacrifice of the estate's essence in exchange for dominion over its creatures. I can feel them, every heartbeat, every breath. And they will defend what is mine." The prosecution introduced this letter as evidence. The defense claimed it was the fantasy writing of a troubled aristocrat with too much money and too much time. No more real than a Gothic novel. The trial reached its climax on March 15, 1897. The Crown called its final witness, Patrick O'Sullivan, the former head gamekeeper. O'Sullivan had been reluctant to testify, but the prosecution had granted him immunity for any poaching violations he might have witnessed. On the stand, he told the complete story of what he and the other gamekeepers had seen in their final nights on the estate: the circles of dead deer, the midnight ceremonies, the transaction they had witnessed between Ashworth and the stag. "I've worked with animals all my life," O'Sullivan testified. "I know their ways, their nature. What I saw in that deer park weren't natural animals. They were something else, something made unnatural. And Lord Ashworth, he weren't commanding them. He had become part of them. When you looked in his eyes, you could see the herd looking back." The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. Ashworth's solicitor demanded O'Sullivan be examined for sanity. But O'Sullivan wasn't finished. Thomas Brennan was a poacher and a drunk, true enough, but he didn't deserve what happened to him. Lord Ashworth made a bargain with something old, something that was in this land before we named it Ireland, and that bargain required payment. Blood for power. Brennan's death weren't an accident, it was an offering. The defense called their own witnesses, psychiatrists who testified that mass hysteria could explain the gamekeepers, testimonies. Naturalists who proposed that unusual magnetic forces in the area might cause hallucinations. Even a Catholic bishop who denounced the proceedings as superstitious nonsense unworthy of a modern court. The jury deliberated for 6 days. On March 22, 1897, they returned a verdict that satisfied no one: manslaughter by person or persons unknown. The jury couldn't bring themselves to convict Lord Ashworth of murder based on supernatural evidence, but neither could they call Brennan's death an accident. Ashworth walked free on a technicality, but freedom didn't mean escape. The aftermath of the trial destroyed Lord Ashworth's position in society. The Anglo-Irish gentry shunned him completely. His memberships in Dublin clubs were revoked. Former friends crossed the street to avoid encountering him. The church denounced him from pulpits across County Kerry, stopping just short of excommunication. The estate itself became impossible to maintain. No worker would accept employment there, regardless of wages offered. The deer park went unmanaged, the fences fell into disrepair, and the manor house began its slow decay. Ashworth remained alone, walking his lands at night. Then, on November 1st, 1898, All Saints' Day, something changed. A farmer traveling the road past Killarney estate reported seeing lights moving through the deer park, hundreds of them, like torches carried by an invisible army. The lights converged on the manor house and then vanished. The next morning, the farmer's curiosity overcame his fear. He climbed the estate fence and made his way to the manor. He found Lord Edward Ashworth dead in the central clearing of the deer park, in almost the exact spot where Thomas Brennan had died. But Ashworth's death was different. His body showed no wounds, no trauma, no signs of violence. He lay peacefully on the ground, his eyes closed, his hands folded across his chest. The deer had arranged themselves around him in perfect circles, like mourners at a funeral, and every single deer, over 200 animals, was DEA. The new investigation was brief. Dr. Fitzgerald conducted the autopsy on Ashworth and found nothing. No poison, no disease, no injury. The Lord's heart had simply stopped, as had the hearts of every deer on the estate, at precisely the same moment. Father Brennan performed the funeral service, though he refused to consecrate the grave. Some contracts, he said, extend beyond death. What Ashworth began here is not finished. The land remembers. The Ashworth family sold the estate at a massive loss in 1899. The new owners tried to repopulate the deer park, but every animal introduced died within days. They attempted to develop the land for farming, but crops wouldn't grow in the central clearing. Eventually, they abandoned the effort entirely. The property changed hands 7 times between 1899 and 1950, with each owner reporting the same problems. Animals wouldn't graze there, workers wouldn't stay after dark, and on certain nights, particularly All Saints' Day and the winter solstice, lights could be seen moving through the abandoned deer park. In 1963, the Irish government acquired the property through eminent domain and declared it a nature preserve. They built a high fence around the perimeter and posted signs warning against trespassing. The official reason was protection of sensitive wildlife habitat. The truth, revealed in government documents declassified in 2015, was different. Multiple hikers had vanished on the property between 1950 and 1962. Search parties found no bodies, but they did find something that terrified the authorities. The old oak grove at the heart of the deer park had become something impossible. The trees had grown together, their branches weaving into geometric patterns that seemed to shift when observed. The ground bore marks identical to those found at Brennan's death scene, but now they covered hundreds of square feet, complex mandalas of symbols that predated written language. And at the center of it all, red deer had returned on their own. Wild, unintroduced animals that appeared in the preserve despite the fences, despite the complete absence of deer in the region for decades. These deer are still there today, watched by remote cameras, studied by scientists who can't explain their presence or their behavior. They move in patterns, gathering in circles, standing in formation like soldiers awaiting commands from a general who died over a century ago. Local people don't go near the old Killarney estate. They know the stories passed down through generations about the lord who made a bargain and the poacher who paid the price. They've seen the lights on winter nights. They've heard sounds from the preserve that no deer should make. And sometimes on the anniversary of Thomas Brennan's death, witnesses report seeing a figure walking through the deer park. A man in Victorian hunting attire checking fences that no longer exist, tending to a domain that has passed beyond human ownership into something far older and more terrible. The Killarney estate case represents a unique convergence of historical trauma, social upheaval, and the human capacity for self-destruction through obsession. Whether you believe in supernatural explanations or favor purely psychological interpretations, the events of 1896 to 1898 reveal profound truths about power, isolation, and the costs of trying to control nature itself. The immediate legal impact was significant. The trial established precedent in Irish law for the consideration of psychological testimony in criminal cases. Dr. Sharp's evidence about manipulated memory became foundational in Irish jurisprudence, cited in dozens of subsequent cases involving witness reliability. The verdict of manslaughter by person or persons unknown created a legal category that allowed juries to acknowledge a crime, while admitting that modern understanding couldn't fully explain what had occurred. The case also marked a turning point in how Irish courts treated landlord-tenant disputes involving traditional lands. Prior to 1896, Anglo-Irish aristocrats enjoyed near-absolute authority over their estates. After Ashworth, courts began scrutinizing the behavior of landowners more carefully, particularly regarding their treatment of poachers and traditional users of estate lands. The case became ammunition for the Irish Land League, who used it as evidence that the aristocratic system was literally driving landowners insane with power. Dr. Edmund Sharp's research, sparked by his involvement in the trial, led to groundbreaking work in the psychology of suggestion and false memory. His 1899 paper, Collective Delusion and Manufactured Recollection, a study of the Killarney witnesses, became required reading in European psychology programs and directly influenced Jung's later work on collective unconsciousness. Sharp proposed that groups subjected to charismatic authority figures could develop shared false memories so powerful that the participants couldn't distinguish them from genuine experience. This theory has been used to explain everything from religious visions to UFO abduction accounts. But Sharp himself remained troubled by the Killarney case until his death in 1924. In his private journals published posthumously, he admitted, "I provided rational explanation for the dinner guest's amnesia because my profession demanded it, but I cannot explain the physical evidence, the impossible positioning of the bodies, the simultaneous deaths of hundreds of animals, the symbols that caused measurable distress in all who viewed them. I fear we explain away what we cannot understand, calling it psychology when it might be something our psychology cannot encompass." The case influenced Irish literature and folklore significantly. W.B. Yeats referenced it in his 1899 poem The Hosting of the Sidhe, with lines that seemed to directly describe the deer park. "The winds awaken, the leaves whirl round. Our cheeks are pale, our hair is unbound. Our breasts are heaving, our eyes are agleam. Our arms are waving, our lips are apart." Yeats had interviewed participants in the case and incorporated their testimonies into his exploration of Irish mysticism. Bram Stoker, researching Dracula in 1896, followed the trial closely. Several scholars have identified elements of the Ashworth case in Stoker's portrayal of vampiric dominion over animals. The idea of a corrupted aristocrat commanding nature through dark bargains appears in both narratives. The environmental implications proved equally lasting. The Killarney estate became one of the first examples of land deemed too dangerous for human use, due to unclear but documented hazards. The 1963 decision to create a closed preserve set precedent for similar actions at other sites where unexplained deaths or phenomena occurred. Today, at least 17 locations across Ireland and Britain are classified as sensitive historical sites with restricted access, a euphemism that often means, "We don't understand what happens here, but it's not safe." Modern researchers studying the case have proposed various explanations. Toxicologists suggest that ergot fungus contaminating grain could have caused the hallucinations and shared delusions reported by witnesses. Historians note that 1896 was a period of extreme stress in Irish society, with crop failures, political unrest, and cultural upheaval creating conditions ripe for mass hysteria. Anthropologists point to similarities between Ashworth's alleged practices and ancient Celtic kingship rituals, where rulers claimed authority through symbolic marriage to the land itself. But these explanations struggle with the physical evidence that remains inexplicable: the positioning of Brennan's body, the simultaneous deaths of the deer population, the documented temperature anomalies, the symbols that caused measurable psychological distress. Perhaps the most significant implication concerns what we choose to believe about reality itself. The Killarney case asks us to consider whether there are genuinely inexplicable events that defy rational analysis, or whether we simply haven't developed the framework to understand them yet. It challenges the Victorian faith in scientific progress and rational explanation that dominated the era. In our modern world, with its surveillance technology and forensic science, could such an event occur without definitive explanation? The answer might be more disturbing than we'd like to admit. Unexplained deaths still happen. Physical evidence still contradicts testimony. And there are still places, the Killarney estate among them, where people report experiences that don't fit our understanding of how the world should work. The case also reveals the dangers of isolation combined with unlimited power and esoteric knowledge. Ashworth had wealth, education, and freedom from oversight, a combination that allowed him to pursue obsessions to their darkest conclusion. How many others have walked similar paths in private, their experiments and bargains never exposed because they didn't end in such spectacular failure? Thomas Brennan's death was ruled an accident by nature in the final analysis. But the evidence suggests something far more troubling, that a man driven by obsession to control the natural world succeeded, at least partially, and that his success required sacrifices that included not just animals but human lives. The poacher who spent his life defying aristocratic property rights became the ultimate victim of aristocratic excess, killed by the very wilderness he knew so well, turned against him by someone who had corrupted the ancient relationship between land and life. The Killarney estate stands today as a monument to what happens when human ambition confronts forces it cannot truly control. The deer still gather in circles. The old oak grove still bears its impossible patterns. And on winter nights, if you stand at the fence line and listen carefully, you might hear what sounds like footsteps moving through the forest, accompanied by the soft clicking of many hooves, an army of nature patrolling lands that belong to neither the living nor the dead, but to something in between. What do you think really happened in the Killarney Deer Park in 1896? Was Lord Edward Ashworth a man who discovered genuine supernatural power, or was he simply an isolated aristocrat whose obsessions created an elaborate delusion that culminated in murder? Did Thomas Brennan die by misadventure, or was he sacrificed to something older than Christianity, older than civilization itself? Leave your theories in the comments below. Tell us what you think about the evidence we've presented, and if you've ever experienced something that defied rational explanation, share your story with our community. Subscribe to The Silent Abbey for more lost chapters of history that textbooks dare not mention. We explore the darkness between facts and folklore, the places where official records end and genuine mystery begins. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a descent into the past's darkest corners. The truth is rarely simple, and the past holds secrets that still have power to disturb us. Until next time, remember, some bargains outlast those who make them, and some lands never forget what was done on them. See you in the next video.